Hannah and Bowling. A Sweet Curvy Girl short romance story. Written by Misha Quinn, 2024. All rights reserved. Copyright Misha Quinn, 2024. Narrated by Mickminster Pro Synthetic Voice, 2024. Hannah and Bowling. It was a warm summer evening, a Saturday. A ruddy, pleasant-looking, well-built young woman was setting the table in the cottage's kitchen. The furnishings were not rich, but everything was tastefully done, and cleanliness was conspicuous. Children's voices and a man's baritone were heard from the room next to the kitchen. Hannah turned around at their voices and shouted, "Wait a minute, I'll make an omelet and you can go to dinner." Busy with these worries of preparing food for dinner, the woman suddenly stopped and looked at the billboard hanging on the kitchen wall. It was a small-format bowling advertisement. Next to it was a mirror in which Hannah could see herself full-length. Also on the same wall was a picture of Hannah's wedding. Her husband was handsome, and she was not at all. Plus, Hannah had been much fuller than she was now. Hannah smiled and, tilting her head slightly to the side, stopped. The omelet sizzled under the lid on the skillet, but Hannah was wholly immersed in the memories. 10 years ago. Hannah did not like looking in the mirror. Her reflection did not appeal to anyone and was almost disgusting. Almost, yes, almost, because her looks were still average, just nothing that stood out among her coworkers. Hannah had only recently joined this factory to produce precision parts for modern industry, and she was immediately attracted to not having to look like a mannequin. She was valued for her ability to follow instructions correctly, to meet her quota per shift, and to be pleasant to her coworkers on her lunch break. Hannah expected nothing less from her working life. She had never dreamed of a career like this. She just wanted to earn enough to pay her bills and live independently of her parents. Hannah idolized her family. She did not understand why the state separated parents from children by some barrier in official matters. Her parents were as much a part of her family as her potential future children. Yes, tears came to Hannah's eyes at the thought of the children. She did not know when she would have a family of her own, and what it would be like to hold her child in her arms instead of her nephew's. Hannah was not planning on getting married soon, and having children without a life partner was out of the question. She knew she could not give a proper upbringing to a child alone, as she had examples of friends who were divorced or had children without a husband, and his involvement in child rearing. Hannah did not think about money. She was sure she would earn something while she was young and healthy. However, her husband's participation in the child's upbringing was a prerequisite for her to have a family. But Hannah did not want to admit to herself that, in fact, her hesitation to even start a romantic relationship was dictated by her insecurity about her appearance. In her 24 years, the young woman was quite overweight. Hannah suffered because she barely had a waist. But the waist had to be separately emphasized with a belt to draw attention to its presence. So Hannah hid her body behind many shapeless clothes, trying to dress like a teenager in her 20s. A job where she had to change into overalls and boots did not give her an excuse for various clothing styles. In addition, in her spare time, Hannah abused cosmetics. Huge false eyelashes, thickly lined eyebrows, and a thick unnaturally tan tone on her skin made her face a mask. And this mask protected her from reality, from her, as it seemed to her, utterly unattractive appearance. But that was something she did not want to admit, even to herself. Why did she have to hide behind rough clothes and bright makeup? This insecurity was so pressing her that when she got out of the shower, she could not look at herself in the mirror and imagine someone else would admire her. One day, Hannah arrived at work, and right in the hallway where the doors to the separate changing rooms for women and men were located, she literally bumped into a guy standing with his back to her. looking at the lettering on the doors in that hallway. "Oh, I'm sorry," exclaimed Hannah, as usual, immediately lowering her gaze. She did not want to see the well-known her expression change on the face of a man as he examined her, and immediately made the usual judgment, "This one's no good for anything." Hannah, her head still habitually lowered, tried to slip into the women's room. Still, the guy stopped her with his hand against the corridor wall and blocked the young woman's path. "Hi," he replied, and Hannah could hear the genuine friendliness in his voice. Hannah stopped. She hesitated to flip his arm away to walk further, as the guy looked at her with interest. "Here you are to help me," he said confidently, still not removing his hand from the wall. Hannah turned her back to the wall and, standing directly in front of the guy, finally looked directly into his eyes. Her eyes widened with surprise. Standing before her was a tall, slender, broad-shouldered guy with thick black, close-cropped hair and swarthy skin. His eyes smoothed out his mocking expression. They were almost green, a rather unusual eye color for men in her area, where everyone had brown eyes. Hannah still could not get a word out, and the guy took the initiative to speak. "I hope you can help me. I don't know how to find the HR department. It's my first day on the job today, but I don't know where to go first, the shop supervisor or the HR department." Hannah was relieved that her knowledge was enough to give him sound advice. She took a deep breath and looked down at the guy's shirt collar, which revealed the thick dark hair on his chest, and replied in a suddenly grave voice, "You need to come just to the factory. The shop supervisor will find you there and give you all the instructions." The guy sighed with relief, stepped back a little from the woman, and lowered his hand, giving her a pass. "Thank you. You've been truly kind to me and helpful. What's your name?" "Hannah," the woman replied simply, and slipped quickly along the wall to the door of the women's room. She turned around once more to look obliquely at the man who was now speaking to her. He was standing there, still looking after her, and a friendly smile was on his lips. Hannah turned away, walked into the ladies' room, and sat down on the couch with a sigh of disappointment, dropping her bag beside her. Hannah knew she would have this stranger in her dreams for a long time. She also knew that it would be excruciating for her to watch many of her single female colleagues flirt with this handsome man that any woman in the world would be honored to possess. Hannah realized she had noticed no wedding ring on the fingers of his hand as he rested it against the wall, which meant that, at least in his mind, he was a free man. Hannah pulled on her work clothes as she changed, hatefully trying to cover her body with shapeless overalls. However, in her soul, somewhere deep, lived the hope that she still attracted the attention of this newcomer. But how? Hannah remembered that since high school, when she was not as full of herself as she was now, all her attempts to take the initiative with guys had been a complete failure. Perhaps that was why she had gotten too much plus size. Food became her pleasure, her salvation from negative emotions. With these thoughts, the young woman, having completely changed her clothes, went to the workshop. There, during the day, her mind was constantly spinning with thoughts of her fate and the fact that she once again had unfulfilled hopes that would remain fantasies. That day, Hannah did not meet the newcomer again. The next day, neither did she. Gradually, his image remained as a cloud of pleasant male odor and some incredible physical attraction that never faded from her dreams. Yes, dreams will be enough for me, she thought, once again going to bed with thoughts of the stranger. Meetings with friends and girlfriends, who were happy to invite her into their company, knowing that no one would take advantage of her, did not please her. Hannah was sick of being the dopey girl who was invited to visit, knowing that no man would take a shine to her. Hannah almost fell into a kind of depression. But one day, Just before the summer vacation, Hannah came to work. She heard everyone was called after her shift for an evening of bowling. It was a tradition. In a couple of years, Hannah had worked here. She was familiar with this outing where she and her coworkers had fun and competed in bowling scores. After the entire shift, in a strangely uplifting mood, Hannah changed clothes. She headed to the nearest bowling alley with her friends from work. A couple of lanes were reserved for them where they could safely knock down heavy pins with a ball. Like the other bowling goers, Hannah put on the shoes she had been offered, the soles of which would not damage the surface of the lanes, and walked to the lanes they had been given. Several men had already arrived, whose shifts had just ended. Some were familiar to Hannah, and she said hello to them in a friendly manner, as if but not to anyone individually. She did not get a good look at everyone there, so she turned away and waited for her turn. But her more active friends were first and started throwing, or rather rolling balls, trying to knock down as many pins as possible to win. Hannah did not want to wait in vain, and, having given up hope of getting her turn soon, just stood back and watched her colleagues' attempts from the sidelines. Suddenly, a pleasant baritone sounded above her head. "There you are?" Hannah, without turning around yet, could smell him. Her cheeks flushed, and she twisted toward the one who had uttered the phrase. Yes, there he was, standing in front of her, the same handsome man she had only seen in her dreams lately. The guy was looking at her with no assessment of her appearance. Hannah immediately understood the significance of such looks. Yeah, there's nothing to be gained here. But this time, the man looking at her was not evaluating her looks. He was looking directly into her eyes. "Hi," she whispered. Hannah's lips barely moved. It was as if she were in a dream. "I'm sorry, Hannah. I forgot to introduce myself. My name is Joshua, or more simply Joe." Hannah knew she was wasting her eyes on this guy. He would turn away in a minute anyway, and go to the group of young women coworkers. Hannah noticed out of the corner of her eye that they had stopped throwing the ball, and were looking in her direction with curiosity and even some envy. Her co-workers, all mostly young women, saw who was talking to her, and soon, this magic moment in Hannah's life would be over, as all her female colleagues would pounce on this guy. "Nice to meet you," she replied quietly, keeping her gaze on his face. She scrutinized his every feature, trying to memorize it. His smell would never be confused with anyone else's anymore. It was so unique, very tart, and enjoyable. But the guy went on, "How are you?" Hannah watched his beautifully shaped, full lips utter the phrase and answered just as quietly, "I'm okay. And you?" The guy friendly nodded. "I'm fine, too." He continued talking to her, ignoring that a crowd of women had gathered around them, waiting for their turn to strike up a conversation with him, or, better yet, flirt with him. And what was he doing next to that unassuming plus-sized woman? Hannah tore her gaze away from Joe's face and looked around. Yes, her moment was over. One of her most attractive and confidently irresistible female colleagues stood beside her. Hannah lowered her head and backed away from Joe, intending to walk away. Still, he suddenly stepped toward her, not giving her a chance to dissolve into the crowd surrounding them. "And what shop do you work in?" he asked interestedly. "In shop number 2, she mechanically replied, not believing her ears. Why would he want to know that? This flashed through Hannah's mind. He never showed up at our place at all, and it's all for nothing. He'll never, ever come near me again. But Joe clearly had no intention of stopping his conversation. He, ignoring the surrounding people, deftly took Hannah under the elbow, gently but insistently, and, looking her in the eye, said, "I have an unpaid debt to you, my just Hannah." There was irony and warmth in his voice. "So come on, I'll show you how bowling really should be done." A dumbfounded Hannah followed him. By some miracle, Joe immediately got a spot at the beginning of the bowling lane, and, deftly picking up the heavy ball, took aim and knocked down all the pins for the first time. There were admiring exclamations from both men and women. The handsome man gave himself even more weight because he could do something perfectly. His further series of successful approaches and many knocked-down pins confirmed that this was no accident. Hannah stood next to his lane and watched him move with admiration. His whole body was like one mechanism, a stance with the bowling ball in his hand, a forward lean, a squint of his eyes assessing the situation, and a throw. Joe's bowling ball hit the pins, as if they were magnetically attracted to him. Hannah stood nearby and realized something important was happening in her life. Joe turned to her and said, a little out of breath, "Okay, now it's your turn." Hannah, completely confused, looked around, almost fearfully. Her coworkers were looking at her and waiting for her reaction. The women nearly hated her for being the one their handsome man was now talking to. Hannah felt like she was about to fall to the ground. "But I'm not playing well," she whispered. Joe, springing from foot to foot, heated by the throws of the heavy ball, looked at her, and realized that Hannah was not lying. Joe put the ball down on the floor, stepped closer to Hannah, and said confidently, "Well, I'll teach you then. I owe it to you. You helped me so much on my first day at this job." Hannah laughed involuntarily. She was happy that Joe remembered her. How much longer were they talking at the first meeting? The woman nodded in agreement and looked questioningly at her coworkers. Their gazes were suddenly no longer displeased with her. The coworkers were just looking at her and Joe and rejoicing at her bowling success. Hannah realized that she herself had exaggerated their negativity towards her. "And what is it with me? Why do I keep belittling myself? I'm a normal person," she thought as she listened to Joe's explanations of how to stand and what to do to throw the ball more accurately. Hannah tried to do everything as Joe advised and hit a complete set of pins for the first time. She was as happy as a child. And when she did, she suddenly realized that Joe was hugging her, not like in her dreams, hot, but friendly, almost not touching her body, just her shoulders. Hannah rolled her head back, looking into his eyes, and said, "Thank you. That's the first time I've ever hit all the pins like that." Joe was pleased. He still did not look at anyone around him, and had no intention of stopping talking to Hannah. The young woman, unexpectedly, reached up and fixed a strand of Joe's hair that had fallen over his eyes. The gesture was perfectly natural, but Joe suddenly grew severe and, without releasing Hannah from the ring of his arms, said, "Thank you for being such a sincere person." Hannah was as if in oblivion. "This is all just a dream. I'm dreaming. He can't talk to me like this. He can't hold my shoulders like that." Here, Hannah's thoughts were interrupted as Joe broke the cycle of her self-injury again. "Shall we go somewhere quieter from here? Truth be told, I'm tired after a long shift, and I don't want to spend the whole evening here. I have to go back to work tomorrow, and you tell me a bit about yourself, and I will too." The next day, Hannah woke up and stretched out in bed with pleasure. She slept so sweetly and soundly that the alarm clock annoyed her with its ringing. Off to work again, and that was after spending the whole evening with Joe. Yesterday, they went to the bar next to the bowling alley and, after getting a couple of light drinks, sat around until late in the evening telling each other about themselves. At first, it seemed to Hannah that Joe was the opposite of her with his looks, but then it turned out that his good looks were not what he wanted out of life, and Hannah suffered from the same affliction as Joe. Her looks were not what she wanted out of life. But what was it about looking? It is about heart and attitude. And from that evening on, Hannah knew that she and Joe had a future. She did not know what that future would be, happier or not, but just his tender kiss goodbye, right on the lips, showed her he liked her as a woman. What would happen next, Hannah did not know, but her certainty that she could be attractive to men overcame her in a wave of unexpected self-discovery. And now food would not be her defense, and now her body would be no reason to be unloved. If a man like Joe preferred her society to that of recognized beauties, then Hannah had something to look forward to in life. Back to our time. Saturday morning passed into a day filled with family concerns and then into the evening. Hannah and Joe sat on the terrace of their cottage and watched the sun sink over the edge of the hill. Suddenly, it was night and only the lights in the windows of the surrounding cottages showed that someone was still awake. Hannah touched Joe's arm. "Shall we go?" Joe, still not moving, covered her hand with his. "Let's go." The children had already gone to bed, and the couple returned to the cottage. Joe put his arm around Hannah's shoulders, and looking into her eyes, whispered, "Well, here we are, the two of us." There was no need to say anything more. It was just as it had been 10 years ago when Joe had looked Hannah in the eyes for the first time and said, "Hi." The end. Written by Misha Quinn, 2024. All rights reserved. Copyright Misha Quinn 2024.